This one's going to be about food, but the representation of food in regards to the Filipino identity is a highly contested topic. I recently talked about the issue of appropriation on the Barkada wine bar and my interview with a friend, but I realized my statements require a lot more background. This is something that needs to be talked about when it comes to current discourse. There's a philosopher by the name of Charles Taylor, known for emphasizing the importance of social institutions and the development of the individual and one's own identity. In his 1991 lecture, The Malaise of Modernity, he pretty much destroyed several Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke and Thomas Hobbes because of the way they neglected the way individuals are composed from their social background, how their social environment gives meaning. So what does this man have to do with the issue of identity and representation? What does this have to do with people like Katy Perry being accused of appropriation or Native American clothing being worn in Halloween parties? There is the usual argument that posits what makes culture valuable is not the connection between person and culture, but that cultures constitute different ways of understanding the world that have developed over time and held power over people. What this sort of centrist statement fails to consider is that the very fact that holding power over people is exactly the problem. Oppression over cultures is not a stationary thing that stays in the past. Sure, it can serve as a source of wisdom, it can teach us how to live, things that we did wrong. They are always evolving, with people coming together singing Kumbaya as if colonialism didn't exist. This unfortunately ignores many ideological factors drawn from history. Take, for example, Edward Said's work on the ways in which Western nations have historically warped our idea of the East, in a compilation of his arguments in a book called Orientalism, which lays the foundation of analyzing the ways in which the West perceived and interpreted Eastern civilizations through their biased lens. The very literature that studied these cultures held a very discriminatory and romanticized view of Eastern cultures. Some of these biases sometimes lead to misunderstanding of values and intolerance of harmless rituals. This way of looking at Eastern cultures had continued through history, especially with blatantly racist and fetishizing images represented in media, like Egyptomania that fueled British culture, or the Fu Manchu character in comic books and film. Sometimes they can be self-aware, such as Edgar Allan Poe's satire Some Words with a Mummy in 1845 that was a satirical commentary on Egyptomania. If any of this is still going over your head, then let us begin with the lowest common denominator of representation: food. If you quickly Google Filipino food reviews, you will get a variety of results, from so-called food aficionados to random forums of people discussing their opinions. You would be surprised to what people are saying about Filipino food, even from Filipinos themselves. In one Quora post, "Why is Filipino food considered so much worse than the rest of Asia?" signaling to the readers that this is being debated, and I can assure you, this is no proper articulated dialogue that is considerate of marginalized voices or self-aware of its own biases. One user, who is obviously not Filipino, claims it is one of the most boring cuisines of Asia. Well, I'm sorry to inform you that even the chef of the White House, who happens to be Filipina, may disagree with you. Being the first woman of Asian origin to hold the executive chef title since 2005 would carry more weight than your opinion. She will even tell you that President Obama himself prefers halo-halo oftentimes than every other ice cream. I know this is a bit nitpicking, but since when did the quality of food depend on the cultural background? Did anyone not think that perhaps the chef at the time just wasn't into it? It is different when you simply have a choice in what to eat and what you are allergic to, or have any health issues. There's nothing wrong with that. But when you decide to base an entire culture on a single experience, you don't see me going around the city of Chicago tasting deep dish thinking this represents all of America and say mean things about it. Every state in America has its own style, and we're talking 50 states. The Philippines, on the other hand, has hundreds of regions, each with their own food and a different version of that same food. An empanada in the Ilocos region would be different from the Visayas region. And not to mention that Latin America has its own version of empanada. But as with every stupid form of generalization, this is nothing new. Let's talk about the more blatantly racist aspect of discriminating food. Some of you are familiar with MSG, otherwise known as monosodium glutamate. In the Philippines, it is widely known and used on many foods. Filipinos commonly know this as Ajinomoto, which is the brand that produces and distributes this flavor enhancer. You may also notice that MSG is looked down upon for decades. Why? Because once upon a time, in America, this flavor enhancer was believed to have caused Chinese restaurant syndrome. That's not a joke. A controversy surrounding the safety based on this overreaction began in the late 60s, when some doctor wrote an editorial to the New England Journal of Medicine, coining the term, suggesting several possible causes of feeling sick after eating Chinese food, and somehow nominated MSG for the symptoms just because it was being used. By the way, MSG has actually been used for more than a century to season food, which is essentially just high salt and high glutamate content. But because of the Chinese restaurant scare, many Asian-owned restaurants now fear that they will lose business by having MSG. So you will eventually see signs of no MSG used as a result of this decades-long propaganda. So it's no surprise that many left-leaning activists claim that the perpetuation of the negative image of MSG through the Chinese restaurant syndrome is caused by xenophobic bias. In fact, food critic, writer, and all-around badass Anthony Bourdain made it clear himself about the truth of MSG in an episode of Parts Unknown, and I quote, "I think MSG is good stuff. You know what causes Chinese restaurant syndrome? Racism. I mean, how would you feel if you had to remove an important ingredient from your family's recipe? It is essentially the same as removing a part of your own culture. Sometimes this stigma is normalized in cheeky humor. I remember watching the Filipino YouTube comedian Mike Bustos doing his parody rendition of Let It Go, where he pokes fun at Filipino parents, unashamed of using MSG and reacting to it. Very funny, by the way, not to knock on his humor or content, but it's important to address how this racist attitude is adapted to Filipino culture and being normalized. Luckily, as far as Filipino food is concerned, there is a rise in appreciation of cuisine being done in many ways. But don't take my word for all that I said. I interviewed the head chef of Lumpia Company.
People don't understand that Filipino food, you can't really separate it from, like just kind of like the culture of how Filipinos are. Think about how most people have had Filipino food. They've mostly had Filipino food, in group settings where Filipinos bring food to it. So as far as like even wondering if Filipino food's even good, I've heard all the same criticisms when it comes to Filipino food as opposed to different regional like Thai, Vietnamese and all that. Filipino food stands up just as well as, any other one. And what we do at Lumpia Company is a little bit different than, typical Filipino restaurants. But yeah, Filipino food, even forget what the guy's name was, Zimmerman, who does the show, Bizarre Foods. He said Filipino food is probably the next big thing in America. I believe the future is bright. I believe there's a lot of great young chefs, young Filipinos, that are doing great things with the food and representing the culture really well. As a chef, I've taken a different take on Filipino food, and I've noticed that within the community, they either absolutely love it or absolutely hate it. But I've received a lot of love and a lot of support within the community, and they say, you're doing great. Keep doing what you're doing. Keep in mind that we got to do the best that we can, and we got to serve the community the best we can.
In the Hampton Roads Tidewater region of the Virginian coastline, Filipino food is being used and prepared in many different ways, not just traditionally, but also in hybrid fusion restaurants, including Alkaline, Zach's Lumpia and Company, Auntie's, which has a more tiki bar approach, and S'mores Amore. That's right, s'mores, which sells specialty flavors of different s'more dishes. Some featured based on Filipino desserts, including ube, jackfruit, just here in the Hampton Roads alone. So yeah, screw you haters, Filipino food is not disgusting. Even travel vlogs on YouTube are showcasing Filipino food in the Philippines that are not disgusting. People love them. White people love them. Obama loves them. Thanks, Obama. Representation plays a big deal in the way we perceive a culture, and ways in which food is prepared and presented does require some literacy. I talked to a graduate colleague of mine who has this to say about the relationship between food and literacy.
So my name is Walter Gray. I was a master's in critical food studies in the humanities department. Some time looking at I believe it's Netflix, the show Nailed It, and how it communicated and developed what I called culinary illiteracy. Just this idea of not being knowledgeable about food. So the thesis really revolved around the idea of culinary literacy. And then how that translated into larger context in society. So, for example, Aramark a few years ago between New York University and a college Midwest, I forget which college it was, during Black History Month, they had a couple of faux pas relative to Black History Month and how they were presenting specific food items. So the argument I made was that due to culinary illiteracy, these faux pas came to fruition. And then on the opposite end of that, I looked at culinary literacy and its positive effects or the potential positive effect in our social climate. There was a restaurant called Conflict Kitchen. Conflict Kitchen only served food from countries with which the United States was in direct conflict, countries or organizations or entities that the United States was in direct conflict with, as a way of showcasing that just because through the media we might see all these negative images about this group of people, they are still people, they still have identities, they still have families, they still have food. And Conflict Kitchen used that and used food as a way to bring people together and bridge those gaps. So in addition to just serving the food, they would also have interviews with people from that country or that region, that area. They would have direct talks. They would have intentional dialogues to promote culinary literacy as well as cultural literacy. You see that's something that's prevalent in the African American culture too, the idea that MSG is going to kill you. Still some products that you will see MSG listed as having, even though culturally speaking, it's something that is very much a taboo and frowned upon. And I'm also thinking of blood and food, like pork blood, for example, and how that is something that is very taboo, and people in this country at least are very much against the idea of blood and food. So one thing that I've been really interested in recently is this idea of witchcraft and food. You have this intent for the food. I'm making a soup and I'm wishing this person well, and how that sometimes can infiltrate the soup, almost the food itself, and then go out to that person. So they end up ingesting the food as well as ingesting your intentions for them. A lot to do with just faith in general. It works when you believe it works.
Now, contrary to what people think of representation, which is often measured by how accurate a thing is, it's a lot more than just that. Representation requires capital power, and whoever holds that power has the ability to construct a narrative. Representation produces meaning. For Jamaican British philosopher Stuart Hall, media and representation has a lot to do with the way we perceive certain cultural items and interpret the narrative surrounding them, not just the item being presented alone. Who gets to represent it and how requires that capital power. There is also no fixed meaning until it gets represented. Whoever gets to represent that meaning also becomes dominant. In other words, the business owners of these Filipino restaurants, for instance, being Filipinos themselves, are the dominant presenters and gatekeepers of showcasing Filipino food items. So you can see my concern when it comes to, let's say, the Barcada Wine Bar restaurant in an area where none of the restaurant owners are Filipino. The experience of getting in touch with your heritage is very hard in Western societies, where immigrant-owned businesses are struggling to compete. Therefore, it's a struggle to own and maintain your identity. Slapping a word like Barcada or Taco Bell isn't going to make anyone feel noticed or close to their culture unless it's negotiated. But the lesson here that no one is talking about is consent. I wouldn't want someone to take a photo of my face and wear it like Norman Bates and pretending to be me. That would be wrong and invasive. Let's put it this way. Corporations aren't people. They have no soul. But you know what does? Culture. Culture has a soul. It has a meaning, whether it be indigenous or overseas immigrant workers. Both types of people may define culture differently, but they both share the same concern for identity, and they have every right to complain if they don't feel accepted. By the way, I'm not expecting anyone to be cultural experts. Again, the point isn't trying to be authentic or accurate. The point of representation is about acceptance and feeling at home. Filipinos have this idea that anyone working overseas is rich and spoiled and is losing touch with their culture on purpose. Actually, it's quite the opposite. The fusion restaurants don't get as much controversy because these spaces are owned by Filipino or biracial bodies. I'm not going to feel suspicious when I start to see familiar food items that make me feel at home, or at least seem familiar and invites meaning beyond than just the name. There is this thing called effort. The sad news is, places like Barcada Wine Bar send the wrong signal to Filipino people. And also, most of the opinions on YouTube remain either neutral or completely indifferent, and totally miss the point of the problem. This isn't about just the word, but the meaning it gives, as I've mentioned, and the lack of effort. I really want to go deeper into this case study, so I'm going to save this for another video. Oh, I assure you, I will get to them later. So I want to leave this on a somber yet hopeful note, the best I can. This is not necessarily a political debate, and I want to dismantle the notion of cancel culture, because it frankly does not exist. I want an actual serious discussion on how we can represent ourselves, and I've already explained to you how certain cultural property like food is a big deal to people like me. And that does matter who represents them and what narrative they are making, the amount of effort being put into it. And if there are any comments on my channel who still differ from me because they are on the opposite side of the aisle or that it's a both-sided thing, they are still missing the point. So the next time you visit Angie's Bakery down in Virginia Beach and wonder why people aren't complaining about the fact that a Filipino-owned bake shop sells pepperoni bread when you can just go to a nearby Jollibee's, just remember that Western and Mediterranean dishes are already the norm. Cultural appropriation, like race, has a lot to do with identities having disproportionate mischaracterization of representation. Pepperoni is not a marginalized dish.